Yesterday, something happened far from land, far from cameras, and far from public attention. Yet its consequences may echo across global politics for years to come. In the vast openness of international waters, an oil tanker linked through ownership and commercial networks to Russia was seized by the United States under its sanctions enforcement framework. There were no explosions, no dramatic confrontations, no images of force broadcast across screens. Yet the silence surrounding this moment made it even more powerful. Because when actions take place quietly at sea, they are rarely small. Within hours, Moscow responded sharply, calling the move illegal, provocative, and dangerously destabilizing. What followed was not just a dispute over one vessel, but a clash of legal interpretations, economic leverage, and geopolitical intent between two of the world's most powerful nations. At first glance, this incident may appear technical, even bureaucratic. Another sanctions enforcement story, another legal dispute wrapped in diplomatic language. But that interpretation misses the larger reality. This was not just about oil, and it was not just about one ship. It was about authority, about who has the right to enforce rules beyond their borders, about whether international waters remain neutral space for global trade or become arenas where power is quietly exercised through law and pressure rather than missiles and troops. In today's world, influence is no longer projected only through military strength. It is projected through legal systems, financial controls, trade routes, and the ability to disrupt movement without firing a single shot. According to U.S. authorities, the tanker was operating in international waters but was allegedly linked to networks involved in bypassing sanctions imposed on Russian energy exports. From Washington's perspective, sanctions are not symbolic gestures. They are binding legal tools. If violations are identified and not enforced, the entire framework collapses. Sanctions only work if they are backed by action. Over the past several years, enforcement has expanded far beyond simple trade bans. It now targets shipping logistics, insurance providers, ownership structures, and financial intermediaries. Modern sanction evasion is sophisticated, relying on layered corporate registrations, reflagged vessels, ship-to-ship transfers at sea, and indirect payment channels. U.S. officials argue that this tanker was part of such a system, and that allowing it to proceed unchecked would undermine not only current sanctions, but future ones as well. Russia sees the situation very differently. From Moscow's perspective, applying domestic U.S. laws to a foreign-linked vessel operating in international waters crosses a dangerous boundary. International waters exist precisely because no single country governs them. Global trade depends on shared norms, maritime conventions, and mutual restraint. If powerful states begin enforcing their own laws beyond their territorial reach whenever they deem it necessary, the predictability that global shipping relies on begins to erode. Russia's response focused heavily on this point, warning that such actions set a precedent that could destabilize maritime commerce worldwide. Once that precedent is accepted, even quietly, it becomes harder to draw limits in the future. This disagreement exposes a deeper fault line in the global system. There is no single authority at sea. Maritime law is built on overlapping conventions, flag state jurisdiction, and voluntary compliance. Enforcement, however, depends on power. When national laws collide with international norms, legality becomes a matter of interpretation, and interpretation becomes political. Both sides claim to be defending the rules. Both accuse the other of undermining them. And when that happens, escalation becomes easier than compromise, even if neither side intends open confrontation. Beyond law and sovereignty lies strategy. Every major power considers how its actions will be read by allies, rivals, and neutral states. For the United States, enforcing sanctions sends a clear message that restrictions are real and violations carry consequences. It reinforces deterrence and signals consistency to partners who support the sanctions regime. For Russia, publicly rejecting the seizure serves multiple purposes. It signals resistance to pressure, reassures domestic audiences that national interests are being defended, and warns other countries that compliance with unilateral enforcement carries risks. This exchange is not just legal. It is strategic communication played out on a global stage. Oil turns incidents like this into global events almost instantly. Energy is not merely a commodity. It is economic power, political leverage, and strategic influence. When an oil tanker is stopped or seized, insurers reassess exposure, shipping companies reconsider routes, and traders factor in new layers of risk. Even without an actual supply disruption, uncertainty alone can move markets. Prices react not to what has happened, but to what might happen next. This is why a single enforcement action can ripple outward, affecting shipping costs, energy prices, and investor confidence far beyond the countries directly involved. Amid all of this, the human dimension often fades into the background. Crews aboard such vessels are typically multinational, made up of workers with no role in political decisions or legal disputes. For them, geopolitical tension becomes personal. Detention, uncertainty, and legal limbo are not abstract concepts. Russia emphasized the importance of humane treatment, legal transparency, and due process for the crew, reminding the world that behind every strategic move are individuals whose lives are disrupted by forces far beyond their control. What makes this moment particularly significant is not just what happened, but what it represents. It reflects a world where economic tools increasingly carry physical consequences, where sanctions move from bank accounts to boarding operations, where law becomes an instrument of pressure, where trade routes are no longer assumed to be neutral. The long-standing belief that commercial shipping exists outside of great power, rivalry is slowly breaking down, and once that assumption disappears, global trade becomes more fragile, more expensive, and more politicized. This incident did not happen in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern of strained U.S.-Russia relations shaped by conflict, sanctions, energy politics, and deep mistrust. Each new confrontation adds another layer, making future compromise harder and raising the stakes of miscalculation. What happens next may not be decided publicly. Much will depend on quiet diplomacy, legal maneuvering, and how markets respond in the weeks ahead. But one thing is already clear. This was never just about a tanker. It was about power, authority, and the future of how global rules are enforced in an increasingly competitive world. As the immediate reactions faded from headlines, the deeper implications of the seizure began to surface among policymakers, analysts, and markets. What unsettled many observers was not simply the legality of the action, but the growing pattern it represents. Economic enforcement, once considered a low-risk alternative to military confrontation, is increasingly acquiring physical dimensions. Ships are boarded, cargo is detained, crews are questioned, and each step pushes economic pressure closer to the threshold of direct confrontation, even if no one publicly acknowledges it as such. For decades, global trade functioned on an unspoken assumption. Commercial vessels, especially those carrying energy, were largely insulated from great power rivalry. Even during periods of intense political hostility, the movement of oil and goods continued under shared maritime norms. That assumption is now under strain. The expansion of sanctions enforcement into maritime space challenges the idea that economic competition can remain separate from physical control. When enforcement requires presence, authority, and the ability to stop movement, power inevitably enters the equation. This is where the United States and Russia see the world through fundamentally different lenses. Washington views sanctions as a lawful extension of policy, backed by institutions and alliances. In this framework, enforcement is not escalation, but obligation. To fail to act would be to weaken credibility, not only with adversaries, but with partners who rely on consistent application of rules. From this perspective, the tanker seizure reinforces the integrity of the sanctions regime and signals that compliance is not optional. Moscow, however, views the same action as evidence that sanctions are no longer merely economic tools but instruments of coercion that blur into physical control. From Russia's standpoint, when domestic laws are enforced in international waters, the boundary between law enforcement and power projection becomes dangerously thin. This perception is amplified by the broader context of frozen assets, restricted financial access, and long-term economic isolation. The seizure of a tanker is therefore interpreted not as an isolated legal act, but as part of a sustained pressure campaign designed to constrain Russia's strategic autonomy. The disagreement also exposes a structural weakness in the global system. International law depends on consensus, but enforcement depends on capability. There is no global maritime police force. When disputes arise, powerful states rely on their own institutions, navies, and legal systems to act. Smaller states watch closely, understanding that the rules applied today by one power could be applied tomorrow by another. This uncertainty undermines trust, not only between rivals, but across the entire trading system. Markets respond to this kind of uncertainty with speed and caution. Energy traders price risk before it becomes reality. Insurers reevaluate exposure long before a route becomes unusable. Shipping companies adjust behavior not based on political statements, but on probability. The moment enforcement actions introduce ambiguity into international waters, costs begin to rise, insurance premiums increase, routes are reconsidered, delays accumulate. These changes rarely make headlines, but they shape global commerce in quiet, measurable ways. Europe in particular watches developments like this with unease. Despite efforts to diversify energy sources, European economies remain deeply sensitive to disruptions in global shipping and energy markets. Even indirect uncertainty can translate into higher prices and political pressure at home. For policymakers, this creates a dilemma. Support sanctions enforcement too strongly and risk economic strain. Push back too cautiously and risk appearing divided. In this space, strategic unity becomes harder to maintain. Behind public statements, diplomacy continues in parallel. History shows that moments like this are often accompanied by private communication, aimed at preventing escalation. Governments frequently speak loudly in public while negotiating quietly in private. Legal teams analyze jurisdiction. Diplomats search for off-ramps. Both sides attempt to signal, resolve without triggering a response they cannot control. Whether this incident becomes a turning point or a footnote will depend largely on what happens beyond public view. Another dimension shaping this episode is technology. Modern shipping is monitored continuously through satellites, tracking systems, and data analytics. Cargo origins, ownership structures, and vessel movements are more transparent than ever before. This visibility strengthens enforcement, but it also intensifies disputes. Every action can be documented, challenged, and debated globally in real time. In this environment, legal arguments and political narratives compete just as fiercely as physical actions. What worries many analysts is not this single incident, but what it normalizes. If enforcement actions at sea become routine, commercial space becomes contested space, naval presence increases, escorts become more common, the margin for error shrinks. History suggests that accidents, not intentions, often trigger escalation. When multiple powers operate in close proximity under legal ambiguity, the risk of miscalculation grows. At its core, this moment reflects a deeper transformation. Global competition is no longer confined to diplomacy or battlefields. It now moves through supply chains, legal systems, and trade routes. Economic interdependence remains strong, but trust is weakening. As that trust erodes, states increasingly rely on control rather than cooperation. This is why the seizure of a single tanker carries such weight. It symbolizes a shift in how power is exercised and contested. It signals that the boundaries between law, economics, and force are becoming less distinct. And it raises a question that extends far beyond this incident. In a world of rising rivalry, can global trade remain neutral, or will it increasingly reflect the balance of power between competing states? The answer will not arrive quickly. It will emerge through future actions, responses, and the choices made when similar situations arise again. What is clear, however, is that this episode is not an endpoint. It is part of a longer trajectory in which economic measures acquire physical consequences, and maritime space becomes an arena of strategic competition. In that sense, this was never simply a legal dispute. It was a signal, and signals once sent cannot be unseen. To fully understand why this moment carries such weight, it is necessary to step back and examine how maritime power has historically shaped global order. Control of sea lanes has always meant control of trade, and control of trade has always translated into influence. From the age of empires to the Cold War, naval dominance was never just about defense. It was about ensuring that goods, energy, and resources moved according to rules set by those with power. What made the post-Cold War era different was the belief that those rules had become universal, neutral, and largely insulated from geopolitical rivalry. That belief is now eroding. The seizure of a tanker under sanctions enforcement signals a return to a more contested maritime environment, where legality is interpreted through national interest rather than shared consensus. When one state asserts the right to enforce its laws beyond its borders, even under established sanctions frameworks, it implicitly challenges the neutrality of international space. This does not mean the action is unprecedented, but it does mean its frequency and visibility are increasing, and frequency changes perception. What once seemed exceptional now begins to feel structural. From Washington's perspective, allowing sanctioned networks to operate freely would undermine years of coordinated policy. Sanctions are designed to restrict access, raise costs, and force behavioral change. If loopholes remain open, if enforcement stops at paper restrictions, the entire system weakens. In this view, the seizure was not aggressive, but preventative, a demonstration that enforcement has real consequences and that maritime routes cannot be used to quietly bypass restrictions. The message is directed not only at Russia, but at intermediaries, shipping companies, insurers, and financial institutions worldwide. Moscow interprets this message differently. From its vantage point, the enforcement action reinforces a perception that the global system is increasingly shaped by selective application of rules. Russia argues that sanctions imposed by one group of states should not grant them global enforcement authority, especially in international waters. This argument resonates beyond Russia itself. Many countries that are not directly involved in the dispute quietly share concerns about precedent. They may not support Russia politically, but they understand that expanded enforcement authority could one day affect their own trade and sovereignty. This divergence in interpretation highlights a fundamental tension in the current international system. Globalization created interdependence, but it did not eliminate competition. As rivalry intensifies, states increasingly prioritize control over integration. Maritime space, once treated as a shared commons, becomes a strategic domain. Enforcement actions become tools of influence, and influence, once asserted, invites response. The risk lies not in immediate retaliation, but in cumulative escalation. Each action adjusts expectations. Each incident recalibrates what is considered acceptable. Over time, norms shift not through formal agreement, but through repeated behavior. If tanker seizures, inspections, and detentions become more common, the threshold for confrontation lowers. What was once shocking becomes routine, and routine confrontation is far harder to de-escalate. Energy markets are particularly sensitive to this shift. Oil and gas supply chains operate on confidence. Confidence that cargo will arrive. Confidence that contracts will be honored. Confidence that routes will remain open. When enforcement actions introduce uncertainty, markets respond defensively. Traders hedge, companies diversify routes, governments seek alternative suppliers. These adjustments may seem technical, but they reshape global energy flows over time. They influence investment decisions, infrastructure development, and long-term alliances. For countries that depend heavily on energy imports, the implications are serious. Even if supply disruptions do not materialize immediately, the perception of risk alone can drive up costs. Higher energy prices feed inflation. Inflation fuels political pressure. Political pressure constrains diplomatic flexibility. This chain reaction illustrates how a single maritime incident can ripple outward, touching societies far removed from the original event. Another layer often overlooked is the psychological dimension of power signaling. Major powers do not act only for immediate gain. They act to shape expectations. By enforcing sanctions at sea, the United States signals resolve and capability. By condemning the action forcefully, Russia signals resistance and unwillingness to accept expanded enforcement. Both sides communicate not just to each other, but to the broader international audience. Allies, competitors, and neutral states all interpret these signals and adjust their own behavior accordingly. This signaling dynamic makes de-escalation complex. Backing down publicly risks appearing weak. Escalating risks unintended consequences. As a result, disputes often linger in a gray zone, neither resolved nor fully inflamed. Gray zone competition thrives on ambiguity. It allows pressure without formal conflict, but it also increases the risk of misinterpretation. At sea, where communication can be limited and decisions must be made quickly, ambiguity is especially dangerous. The human element remains central throughout this process. Crews operating commercial vessels are not political actors, yet they increasingly find themselves caught in geopolitical crosscurrents. Detentions, inspections, and investigations place civilian workers under stress and uncertainty. While governments debate legality and precedent, individuals live with the immediate consequences. This human cost rarely shapes policy decisions, but it influences public perception and long-term trust in the system. Looking ahead, the key question is not whether similar incidents will occur, but how often and under what conditions. As sanctions regimes expand and enforcement becomes more assertive, maritime interactions will likely grow more tense. Naval presence will increase under the banner of protection and deterrence. Commercial shipping may require escorts in sensitive regions. Each added layer of security raises costs and heightens the potential for confrontation. What emerges from this trend is a more fragmented global order. Trade routes align with political blocs. Legal interpretations diverge. Trust erodes. Cooperation becomes conditional. This is not a collapse of globalization, but a transformation of it. Efficiency gives way to resilience. Neutrality gives way to alignment. And alignment reshapes the flow of goods, energy, and capital. In this context, the tanker seizure stands as more than an isolated enforcement action. It represents a stress test of the current system. A test of how far economic measures can extend into physical space without provoking escalation. A test of whether shared maritime norms can withstand strategic rivalry. And a test of whether global trade can remain predictable in an era of contested power. The outcome of this test will not be determined by one decision or one statement. It will unfold gradually, shaped by repetition, response, and restraint, or the lack of it. What is certain is that the era of assuming maritime neutrality is fading. The sea, once treated as a connector of economies, is increasingly viewed as a lever of influence. And when influence becomes leverage, every movement carries meaning.